You watch a documentary trailer about a shipwreck, and a thought crosses your mind, the same one that's probably crossed yours before. Why hasn't anyone just brought the Titanic back up? It sounds simple enough. Massive cranes exist, submarines exist, humanity has landed machines on Mars. But the real answer to why the Titanic still sits on the ocean floor is far stranger than a lack of trying. It isn't about money, although money is part of it. It isn't about depth alone, although depth changes everything. The real answer involves biology eating the ship alive, physics working against every rescue fantasy ever pitched, and a quiet, complicated question about whether it should be raised at all. This is the story of why one of the most famous objects in human history remains exactly where it sank, more than a century later. Start with the obvious assumption most people carry. They picture the Titanic sitting on the seafloor, largely intact, resting the way it looked the night it sank, just waiting for the right piece of machinery to lift it home. That image is almost entirely wrong. When explorer Robert Ballard finally located the wreck in 1985, ending decades of searching, what he found wasn't a sleeping ship. It was two enormous separated sections, a bow and a stern, torn apart during the sinking itself, resting more than a third of a mile apart on the ocean floor. Around them, an enormous debris field stretched across the seabed, scattered with thousands of individual objects: shoes, dishware, pieces of hull, personal belongings. Ballard's discovery reframed the entire cultural image of the Titanic overnight. It wasn't a single object anymore. It was a wide, fragile, scattered site. And that single fact already begins answering your question. You can't simply lift a shipwreck that isn't one connected structure anymore. Ballard himself, in interviews and public talks given after the discovery, described the moment of finally locating the wreck as far more sobering than triumphant. He had expected, like most people, something closer to a recognizable ship. What his cameras actually showed him was closer to a scattered graveyard. Boilers scattered across the seafloor, the two main hull sections resting at odd angles, one partially buried in sediment. He later became one of the strongest public voices arguing against large-scale salvage operations at the site, a striking position for the very person who found it in the first place. It's worth pausing on why the ship broke apart in the first place, since that detail matters for understanding its current condition. As the Titanic sank, the enormous, unsupported weight of the ship's midsection combined with the extreme angle it reached as the bow filled with water and dropped placed stress on the hull far beyond what its steel plating and rivets were designed to withstand. The ship snapped, likely somewhere near the surface or shortly after, sending the two halves down separately, tumbling and twisting as they fell, before settling on the seafloor over a third of a mile apart from one another. But even that explanation is only the surface. The deeper answer requires understanding exactly where the Titanic actually rests, and what that environment does to metal over time. The wreck sits roughly 12,500 feet below the surface of the North Atlantic. That's nearly 2.5 miles straight down. To put that number in a scale your body can actually understand, consider pressure. At that depth, the surrounding water exerts pressure of nearly 6,000 pounds per square inch. For comparison, the tires on a car typically hold around 32 pounds per square inch. The pressure crushing down on the Titanic's remains right now is roughly 200 times what supports the vehicle you might drive to work. This pressure alone makes recovery attempts extraordinarily dangerous and expensive, requiring specialized deep-sea vehicles capable of operating under conditions that would instantly crush an ordinary submarine. But pressure isn't even the biggest obstacle. The bigger obstacle is smaller than you'd expect, much smaller. In the early 2000s, microbiologist Henrietta Mann, working alongside a research team studying rust formations on the wreck, identified a previously unknown species of bacteria living on and consuming the Titanic's iron hull. The species was eventually named Halomonas titanicae, directly after the ship where it was first identified. This bacteria does something remarkable, and genuinely strange when you think about it. It consumes iron directly, converting solid structural metal into a fragile, rust-like material researchers call rusticles, delicate icicle-shaped formations that hang off the wreck's surface, some stretching many feet long. Mann's research suggested that these bacteria, along with other related microorganisms, are actively breaking down the Titanic's structure at a measurable, ongoing rate. Estimates from various marine researchers studying the wreck suggest that significant portions of the ship's remaining iron structure could fully decay within the coming decades, potentially by the middle of this century, though exact timelines remain genuinely uncertain and are the subject of ongoing study. This means the Titanic isn't simply resting on the ocean floor, quietly waiting. It's being consumed, slowly, biologically, continuously. Doesn't that completely change the picture in your head? You're not looking at a preserved object frozen in time. You're looking at a structure actively dissolving, cell by cell, colony by colony, into the surrounding seabed. Mann's team calculated something startling about the pace of this process. Certain rusticle formations were found to be growing, expanding, and consuming iron at rates fast enough that researchers could measure visible changes across return expeditions separated by only a few years. That's an unusually fast decay rate for a structure many people still imagine as basically frozen in time, like a photograph sitting untouched on the ocean floor. Compare that to how you probably picture an old shipwreck. Maybe you imagine something like a sunken pirate ship in a movie, still holding its basic shape, covered in a little seaweed, waiting patiently for treasure hunters. The Titanic doesn't match that image at all. Entire sections of the once recognizable superstructure, including large portions of the ship's iconic grand staircase area, have already collapsed inward or disappeared entirely since Ballard's initial expedition in the 1980s. Photographs taken decades apart, comparing the same sections of the wreck, show a visibly deteriorating structure, not a static one. This is part of why documentary teams and researchers treat every new expedition to the site with a certain urgency. Filmmaker and deep-sea explorer James Cameron, who has personally visited the wreck on multiple submersible dives over the years while researching his own documentaries on the subject, has spoken publicly about how dramatically the wreck's condition has changed, even within his own lifetime of visiting it. Sections he filmed on earlier expeditions were noticeably different, sometimes entirely gone, by the time of later visits. This detail alone dramatically undermines the fantasy of raising the Titanic intact. Structural engineers who have studied footage and imaging of the wreck describe hull sections now so fragile that even the ship's own weight is causing portions to collapse under their own mass. Attempting to lift sections of a structure, this compromise risks the entire attempt shattering the wreck further, rather than preserving it. So depth creates one obstacle. Biology creates another. But there's a third layer to this story, one involving the physics of engineering itself. Deep-sea engineer David Gallo, who worked closely with Ballard's research team and has spent significant time studying the wreck's condition, has spoken extensively about the sheer scale of the mechanical challenge involved. Raising an object of the Titanic's original size, over 800 feet long, tens of thousands of tons in original weight, isn't comparable to raising smaller historical shipwrecks that have occasionally been recovered from shallower water. Often less than a few hundred feet deep, using cables, flotation devices, or reinforced lifting rigs attached directly to a largely intact hull. None of these methods translate meaningfully to a depth of 2.5 miles, working against pressure levels that limit both human divers and most mechanical equipment, and working against a structure already critically weakened by over a century of decay. Some early proposals throughout the decades, including surprisingly serious ones, explored shortly after the wreck's discovery, suggested filling the hull with buoyant material, like massive quantities of a lightweight substance to float it gradually to the surface. Engineers studying the proposal concluded that the pressure differential alone between the extreme depth and the surface would almost certainly cause the fragile structure to rupture and collapse during ascent long before it ever reached shallower, safer waters. In other words, even a hypothetical, unlimited budget mission likely couldn't overcome the basic physics involved without risking total destruction of what remained. Think about a much smaller, more familiar version of this same problem. Imagine pulling a piece of wet paper out of a puddle. If the paper is fresh and reasonably thick, it might survive being lifted in one piece. But if that same paper has been sitting in the water for a long time, softening, breaking down at a fiber level, lifting it usually just tears it apart in your hands, no matter how gently you try. Scale that basic problem up to a 50,000-ton steel structure, weakened by biological decay and immense water pressure for more than a century, and you start to understand why engineers studying the wreck consistently reach the same conclusion. The structure isn't stable enough to survive the very process of being lifted. There's also the matter of practical logistics that rarely makes it into popular imagination. Any large-scale recovery operation would require an enormous support fleet, specialized deep-sea vehicles capable of operating continuously at depths far beyond where human divers can safely go, and engineering solutions that essentially don't exist yet in proven, tested form. Some of the deepest working recovery operations in history, including a well-known 1970s attempt by intelligence agencies to recover part of a sunken Soviet submarine, took place at depths shallower than where the Titanic rests, using specially built equipment that still only partially succeeded. And that operation had the financial and technical backing of an entire national government. This is where the popular assumption fully collapses. The Titanic isn't sitting there unraised because no one has tried hard enough or spent enough money. It's unraised because engineering, biology, and physics have combined to make the very idea functionally impossible using any currently existing recovery method. Now, here comes the counterintuitive twist, the part of this story that reframes the entire question. Even if a future engineering breakthrough somehow solved the mechanical and structural challenges, a separate, quieter debate has been unfolding for decades among historians, marine archaeologists, and maritime law experts over whether the Titanic should be raised at all, even if it somehow became possible. Historian and Titanic researcher Parks Stevenson, who has closely studied the wreck across numerous expeditions, has spoken about a shift in how the site is now widely regarded, not simply as a shipwreck, but as a grave site. More than 1,500 people died in the sinking, and a significant number of those individuals were never recovered. Their remains, or what may remain of them after more than a century underwater, are believed to still rest somewhere within or near the wreck site. This reality has shaped an entire body of international policy. In 2012, the wreck site gained protections under the UNESCO Convention on the Protection of the Underwater Cultural Heritage, an international agreement designed specifically to protect historically and culturally significant underwater sites from disturbance, looting, or destructive salvage attempts. This means the conversation around raising the Titanic isn't purely a mechanical or financial question anymore. It's an ethical one. Many maritime historians and descendants of those who died on board have expressed strong opposition to disturbing the site at all, viewing large-scale recovery attempts as equivalent to disturbing a mass grave, rather than simply retrieving a historical artifact. Isn't it strange that the biggest obstacle standing between the Titanic and the surface might not be engineering at all, but a very human question about respect for the dead? This ethical dimension adds a layer that dramatically complicates the entire question, well beyond any simple mechanical fantasy of cranes and cables lifting a rusted hull back into daylight. Consider how differently you might react to two separate scenarios. One involves a research team carefully photographing and documenting a shipwreck from a respectful distance, gathering data without touching the site. The other involves a large commercial operation, hauling pieces of the hull to the surface for display, potentially disturbing remains still resting somewhere within the wreckage. Even without a formal law explaining why, something in you likely reacts differently to each of those two scenarios. That reaction isn't random. It reflects a widely shared human instinct about the difference between studying history and disturbing the dead. An instinct that international policy on the site was eventually built to formally protect. This is also why expeditions to the wreck today operate under much stricter guidelines than they did in the earlier decades following its discovery. Some of the earliest expeditions in the years immediately after Ballard's find did recover smaller artifacts, dishware, personal items, and pieces of the hull structure for preservation and public display in museum exhibitions. Even those earlier, comparatively limited recovery efforts generated significant public debate at the time, with some historians and descendants arguing that even small-scale removal of items crossed a line the site's status as a gravesite shouldn't allow. That ongoing tension helped shape the stricter international protections that followed. There's an additional layer worth understanding here too, one connected less to ethics and more to the wreck's ongoing scientific and historical value exactly where it currently rests. Marine researchers studying the site have emphasized that the wreck, in its current natural state, continues to offer valuable scientific insight, particularly regarding deep ocean ecosystems, corrosion processes, and even microbiology, given the unusual bacterial colonies discovered directly because of man's research on the site. Removing or disturbing the wreck could permanently eliminate opportunities for exactly the kind of ongoing scientific study currently underway. In a strange way, leaving the Titanic where it rests has become more scientifically valuable, in certain respects, than any hypothetical recovery ever could be. The wreck has effectively become a long-term, real-world laboratory, because researchers know exactly when the ship sank and roughly what materials and construction methods were used to build it. They have a rare, precisely dated starting point for studying exactly how deep ocean environments break down large steel structures over long periods of time. That kind of dated baseline is extremely difficult to find anywhere else in the ocean. Engineers studying modern offshore structures, pipelines, and even other historical shipwrecks have referenced findings from Titanic research when modeling how metal degrades under similar deep-sea conditions elsewhere in the world. There's also an ecological angle worth noting. The wreck has slowly become an artificial reef of sorts, a hard structure on an otherwise largely flat, sediment-covered seafloor, now home to various deep-sea organisms that have colonized its surfaces over the past century. Removing the structure wouldn't just erase a piece of history, it would also disrupt a small, unusual ecosystem that has formed around it entirely by accident. This reframes the entire narrative one final time. The Titanic isn't an abandoned mystery, sitting untouched simply because no one has solved the puzzle yet. It's an actively monitored, actively studied, actively decaying historical site, protected under international law, respected as a gravesite, and valued specifically because it remains exactly where it fell. There's a broader pattern hiding inside this specific story too, one that shows up again and again whenever humans confront disasters, ruins, or losses too large to simply reverse. Think about how differently societies treat certain historical sites of mass tragedy. Battlefields are preserved rather than paved over. Memorial grounds are protected rather than redeveloped. In almost every case, the instinct isn't to erase or undo what happened. It's to preserve the physical evidence of it, carefully, respectfully. So the event remains studyable, remembered, and real, rather than smoothed away into convenient forgetting. The Titanic fits neatly into that same pattern, just resting somewhere far less visible than a battlefield or a memorial park. 2.5 miles down, in near-total darkness under crushing pressure, slowly being consumed by a bacteria that didn't even have a name until scientists found it feeding on the wreck itself. Now bring this back to that modern moment. The documentary trailer, the passing thought that crossed your mind. Why hasn't anyone raised the Titanic? Because raising it was never simply a matter of ambition or money. It's a structure being quietly consumed by bacteria discovered specifically because of that consumption. It's a wreck resting under crushing pressure that would collapse the ship further during any recovery attempt. It's an engineering challenge no currently existing technology can realistically overcome without destroying what remains. And underneath all of that, it's a gravesite protected internationally, treated with a kind of quiet respect most casual observers never fully consider. There's something worth sitting with in that final point specifically. The instinct to want to bring it back to see it whole again, to reverse what happened that night in 1912, is deeply human. It's the same instinct that makes you want to fix things you know can't actually be fixed, to undo mistakes, to bring closure to something that still feels unresolved, even from a distance of more than a century. But some things aren't meant to be reversed. Some historical events simply have to be studied, respected, and left exactly where they occurred. Not because no one is capable of intervening, but because intervening would cause more damage, more disrespect, and more permanent loss than simply allowing the site to remain as both a scientific resource and a memorial. You watch a documentary trailer about a shipwreck and a thought crosses your mind, the same one that's probably crossed yours before. Why hasn't anyone just brought the Titanic back up? Now you understand it was never really a question about cranes or cables or budgets at all. It was always a question about what should be left exactly where it rests.